Hello, my name is Peter, and welcome to my brief mini-series on aspects of Florentine history, architecture, and society that I find interesting. I hope by the end of these videos you'll recognize just how significant the developments of Florence became for the rest of the world. And to sort of segue into what excites me most about studying Florentine history, it would be proper to explain the subtitle I'm giving here to Florence, the fifth element. This moniker was first attached to Florence by the great Pope Boniface VIII. He was saying that Florence is in itself a force like earth, air, fire, and water, capable of a lot of things. He, like many others, was struck by both the uniqueness of the city and its transformative influence throughout the Italian peninsula and in Europe in general. This city is an outlier among cities, a special case. And in order to prove that point, I will endeavor to give a brief overview of its development, in order to show in how many ways Florence was a trial grounds for the modern state. At different times, a case study in education, forms of government, or social upheaval, much can be learned from the city on the Arno. For now, let's go back to 1168. In the 12th century, it seemed as if the conditions for the political unification of Italy were in place. Great alliances and confederations of previously independent Italian city-states were formed in order to counter the expansive ambitions of Frederick I, Holy Roman Emperor. Military agreements like the Lombard Confederation kept the emperor at bay through resource pooling. However, as the threat from the north subsided, political union was abandoned in favor of a situation of sharp economic and political competition between the Italian cities and provinces. High barriers to entry were placed on foreign goods, protectionism was the established economic orthodoxy, and thus industries developed differently in many states, and many guilds or businesses were granted monopolies as recompense. However, as time went on, and Florence began to dominate politically and economically the surrounding areas, their opportunities for making money off trade began to increase. The 14th century saw an increase in intra-Italian trade, and the burghers, you might call them the traders of Florence, benefited the most from this new development. Most notably the Medici family, whose astronomical wealth would come to imply first political favors from the city government and later a complete monopoly on the functions of state, with Alessandro de' Medici assuming the title of Florence's duke. It's worth noting here that this transition took place over a long period of time, and the longest-running form of government in Florence was a type of ostensible republican system that took large amounts of bribes and favors from the guilds and other prominent traders. As the form of government in Florence shifted from a rather healthy republic over time to a more aristocratic or oligarchic form of government, and then eventually into a despotism, all the while beginnings of economic democracy were being laid. What this means is, even though the form of government was becoming increasingly held by few, the means of economic production were being increasingly held by more. And this is largely due to technology. As a crystallization point for the Italian Renaissance, Florence was first to utilize the newly developed technologies and industries, like banking and double-entry bookkeeping, to the economic benefits of the citizenry rather than just the businesses of the aristocrats. This is a marked change from the economic system of the medieval era and even the economic systems of more elitist or aristocratic governments like Milan. So this all resulted in a huge shift in the balance of power, which reduced the value of noble titles and increased the value of personal merit within the city of Florence. And with the Medici family not claiming their political legitimacy from birth, but rather from merit and their outsized wealth, they encouraged these new developments in Florence. A greater emphasis began to be placed on the capabilities of individuals, and as a result of this, new sciences began to emerge. These sciences, like statistics, macroeconomic data analysis, and political science, began in a very early form in Florence. To give you an idea of both the accounting prowess and educational zeal of the Florentines, we have detailed statistics available to us from a scholar of the Renaissance named Villani. These date from 1338 a time of Florence's ascendancy. So at this time, according to Villani, there were roughly 90,000 people in the city of Florence. And what's incredible is that 8 to 10,000 of these people would have been students in the schools of grammar, scholarship, the abacus, or languages like Latin, Greek, even Arabic. Villani writes that there were 600 professors and scholars in training at 4 different universities. This is all very impressive stuff, and indicates to us that not only did Florence sponsor education, it became almost necessary in this proto-skilled economy. As the science of statistics improved, incredibly, the statisticians and financial analysts of Florence in 1422 calculated the total number of gold florins in circulation. This doesn't imply all the money is in Florence. By this time, the gold florin was a standard unit of value for European trade. It was even used by kings of France and England. The sheer numbers involved in this collection, the sheer vastness of it, is pretty incredible. And we might think of this as the beginning of monetary policy, because every 10 years an audit was collected by the financial analysts of Florence in order to determine how much new money had to be printed in order to maximize economic benefit. Interesting stuff. As you can see, Florence has a story that we are influenced by today and ought to look more closely at in the future. The sheer dynamism of the city, the intellectual capital which it had at its disposal. These are all exciting to read about. Its political history has lessons to teach us as well, and we ought to be aware that our society is subject to the same passions as that of Renaissance Florence. The factional disputes in the city between supporters of the Pope and supporters of the Holy Roman Emperor can be thought of as a kind of early example of modern political faction. The rise of the revolutionary priest Savonarola shows the consequences of a fast mobilization of a zealous people. There are many events in Florentine history that we look back on as important to the overall history of the West. And a fascinating thing about studying its history is that many of its great figures know and talk about how tremendous its influence will be for the future. They saw themselves as a sort of shining beacon enlightening the world. The most important thing that we inherit from Florence is our notion of civic equality. This is something that scholar Jakob Burckhardt noted in his observations on Renaissance society. And I quote, "Social intercourse in its highest and most perfect form now ignored all distinctions of caste, and was based simply on the existence of an educated class as we now understand the word." Although to Florence alone is not due the equality we have in today's society, I would be well prepared to argue that it played a valuable role in its development. Thank you.